Central technical community. In this role, he utilizes the full spectrum of F5 technology to analyze and solve complex problems for F5 users all over the world. He frequently writes articles and records videos that are featured on the Dev Central website. John is certified in several industry-relevant areas, including CISSP, CEH, and Six Sigma, which is process improvement. Prior to his work at F5, John was communications officer in the U.S. Air Force, where he specialized in ground and satellite networks. After leaving the Air Force, he worked for a technology consulting firm where he analyzed cyber attacks against the U.S. DoD computer systems and networks. John holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering and Master of Science in Computer Networks. I have to tell you about this talk. When we saw at Parameter, when we saw this abstract, we all got giddy. We're like, this is great. And this is one of those, all the non-technical people go, this is Greek to me, and we go, even better. So, I know we're rushing you here, but you're good. Everybody, please give it up for John Wagnon.
Thanks so much, Dave. I appreciate it. Is this on? Is this on? Okay, good deal. I'm gonna hook this up really quick. Make sure everybody can hear me. Okay, good. Can everybody hear me if I put it right there? Good to go, yeah, a bunch of nods, all right. I gotta admit, when I saw the LRS little name, neck thing, I thought at first it said LGB, Let's Go Blues, right? And I know we just said that a second ago, but the first time in franchise history, the Cup came to St. Louis. That's an exciting time, right? Good to go, so let's go Blues. All right. Well, hey, man, it's a pleasure to be here at ShowMeCon. Like Dave said, my name's John Wagnon, and I do some security kind of stuff for F5 networks, and was in the Air Force for a while, did some consulting stuff out here at Scott Air Force Base just across the river, so it's fun to be here and talk to everybody at ShowMeCon. All right, so today we're going to talk about TLS 1.3. Has anybody out there heard of TLS 1.3? Have an idea of what we're talking about here today? A little bit of a clue. It's a pretty interesting advancement in the transport layer security protocol. So the reason this is titled Minor Version, Major Changes is, if you know anything about TLS, you've got TLS, version 1, then 1.1, 1.2 is kind of the major one that we're on right now. And so then you would just think, hey, 1.3, right? It's the next little iteration. Maybe they'll kind of put a new coat of paint on this thing, brush up a couple of things. But as it turns out, this is a pretty major advancement in what the TLS protocol does for encryption on the internet today. So we'll hop into this thing. All right, so transport, you know what, let me make sure this is turned on as well. Okay, there we go. All right, transport layer security is a protocol. And when you think about what a protocol is, it's a set of requirements, a set of ideas that establish how something works properly, right? So if you have, a handshake protocol, and you're going to, reach out with your right hand every time and shake somebody's hand, that's in a sense a protocol. So TLS is a protocol, and fundamentally it provides this secure channel between two communicating peers. And so you have most typically a client, so your internet browser on your laptop or your mobile phone or whatever. And then you've got the web server that you're trying to connect to, right? And so TLS, at its fundamental, base, is providing the protocol that defines how those two peers are going to communicate, and it provides this CIA, the holy trinity of security triad, right? The confidentiality, integrity, and authentication. Confidentiality, I'm sure most of you already know all this, but confidentiality means that only these two endpoints are going to be able to see what is shared, right? So if you have a bad guy in the middle that captures all of this data, all this communication, then they're going to be able to capture that, but they're not going to be able to read it, and they're not going to be able to read it because there's been this encryption that has been put on top of this communication. And so TLS is going to define exactly what kind of encryption is used to encrypt that data, all right? Integrity, the data cannot be modified. If someone were to capture that in the middle and then change a couple of things, if there's a bank transfer and they, moved a 1 to a 10 or a 10 to a million or whatever, they're going to be able to see, hey, that data was changed. So that's the integrity piece. So something has to be there in the TLS protocol to ensure integrity of the information between the client and the server. And then finally, authentication. Whenever you as a client, whenever you as a web browser connect to, ShowMeCon.com, then you want to make sure that that end web server is actually ShowMeCon.com or Amazon.com or wherever you want to go, right? So how do you know it's not somebody else over there? Well, you wouldn't know that except for the authentication mechanisms that are put in place in this TLS protocol. So that's at its basic level, that's what TLS does. Alrighty, if you guys have seen the HTTPS in your URL browser, that's what we're talking about here. Not every single website has that. Sometimes it's just HTTP. There's not the little secure lock thing up there, and it's and in that case, it's not encrypted at all. It's not using TLS, but in this case, that's exactly what we're talking about here. HTTPS. I'm going to go through a quick timeline of the history of the different versions of TLS. So way back in 1994, which seems like an eternity ago in technology time, right? The SSL 1.0 was developed by Netscape, and that thing was so insecure that it never got released at all. So Netscape didn't even release its serious security flaws. They said, we're not going to do it. So a year later, they released SSL v2 in 1995, and then a year after that, SSL v3, which, by the way, is still out there on some web applications today. You guys probably know some of that, alrighty. And then, which, by the way, was an interesting change in who took over the development of this. So Netscape is the one, that company is the one that started all this. And then the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, took over ownership of the development of this protocol when it became SSL version 3 back in 1996. And then in 99, they renamed it from SSL to TLS 1.0, still controlled by the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Which, by the way, just a little side note on this, it's been 1999, this is 2019, right? We've been doing this for, 20 years. Having the acronym TLS, and yet out there a lot when you talk about encryption, people say, hey, is it SSL encrypted? So we're still saying SSL. I don't get it. Maybe we can be the change, and start using TLS instead of SSL. But anyway, nonetheless, TLS 1.0 was back in 99, and then 1.1 came out 7 years later in 2006. And then a couple of years after that, 1.2. And 1.2 is what is still predominantly used today. And frankly, has not had a ton of issues with it. But as you work through the protocol itself, some forms of encryption may not be as secure as they used to be, or maybe there's been some kind of attack that's been shown to be usable on certain types of encryption or key exchange or whatever it is. And then you finally fast forward all the way to 2018. So last year, the IETF ratified or codified the RFC for TLS 1.3. So this thing is brand new. It's still being deployed, kind of trickled out there. But this is where the world is going in the terms of TLS encryption. So it's interesting to know what TLS 1.3 has in it, and if you're a web server administrator, to know how to configure this stuff, or if you turn something on, what does that mean, and how does that affect you, your company or your clients or whatever. All right, so I wanted to show you also the prevalence or the pervasive use of TLS across the internet today. Like we showed on that one lock a second ago, not every single website is HTTPS encrypted, right? And so Google has this cool report. It's called the Google Transparency Report, and I just pulled this yesterday. They update it fairly frequently. So as of, what does that say, May 25th, if you can't see that, across Google itself, so these are clients accessing websites that use the Google search engine, which is the most popular website in the world. 94% of those websites are encrypted, all right? So, I'm sorry, this one is the actual Google controlled properties. I need to clarify that. So these are the Google controlled properties, so like Gmail or YouTube or any of the Google Docs, that kind of stuff. So 94% of all Google stuff is encrypted, so they use this HTTPS. All righty, HTTPS on top sites, this is not Google specific. 90 out of 100 default to HTTPS encryption, and then 96 out of 100, they work on HTTPS, just not every single one of them default to HTTPS. So the point with all of this is everything is moving to encryption. One day, this number is going to be 100%. Everything's going to be encrypted. And so it's interesting to, again, know how this whole thing works. All right, so when we look at TLS 1.3 specifically, and we talk about TLS 1.2, and 1.2 is not like inherently broken where, hey, it's just got these massive flaws like SSL 1.0 had. It's interesting to think about what are the advantages of TLS 1.3. And today I want to talk about two primary advantages. And the first one is security. And if we have learned nothing from security, those who have had the pleasure of watching Paul Blart Mall Cop 2, we know that security is not is a mission, not an intermission, all right? So security is one of the primary things that TLS 1.3 brings. And then the other one is speed. And again, on speed, if you've ever seen the Ballad of Ricky Bobby, we all learned from Will Ferrell that we want to go fast, all right? So, and we also know that we don't really know what to do with our hands when we're in an interview, for those who have seen that movie. All right, so Ricky Bobby taught us to go fast, and Paul Blart taught us to be secure, and so those are two of the big things that TLS 1.3 brings us. I wanted to go over the thing called a handshake, a TLS handshake, and this is prior to version 1.3, and this is where the client or the browser is communicating with the server itself. And so what happens in that case is the client, and I don't know if you can see that really well, but anyway, there's several steps that are involved here. The first step is the client sends what's called a client hello message. And along with that client hello message, the client, so this is your internet browser on your laptop, whatever, the client is going to say, hey, server, hello, I want to start talking secure to you right now, right? And along with that, the client is going to say, these are the Cipher Suites that I support. And we'll get into Cipher Suites here in a minute. And then the server is going to respond with the server hello. And the server hello is going to say, okay, I saw the Cipher Suites that you support. I saw the different cryptography that you are able to talk in. So when I send back my hello, now I have chosen one of those, and then we're going to start to talk here. Alrighty. It also sends its certificate. So if you guys are familiar with public key cryptography and the certificate on a server, it sends that for authentication purposes, and then it sends some server key exchange, depending on the type of authentication or key exchange mechanism that's used. And then it says server hello done. So basically, the server, after the client hello comes in, the server says, okay, I got what you are talking about in terms of cryptography. I've made my decisions, and now I'm sending it back to you with some of my cryptographic material, and now the client has that, so then the client is able to generate some of the cryptographic keys and send back its key exchange material, and then it sends what's called a change cipher spec message, and basically that's the client saying, hey, I've done some of the key exchange stuff, now we're going to move to symmetric cryptography, and then the client sends a finish message, and then the server finally sends back a change cipher spec, hey, we're going to move to symmetric cryptography, and then the server is finished. And after all that stuff happens, you finally have exchange keys between client and server, and then now you can start to communicate securely. So to kind of talk through that a little bit more, the ultimate goal really in the key exchange, when you hear the term key exchange, and there's different algorithms that you can use for key exchange, really what that is that's the client and the web server saying, hey, we want to talk or we want to communicate in a secure way. We want to have encrypted communication between the two of us. But we want to use what's called symmetric cryptography, which is supremely faster than asymmetric cryptography. But that's where they're trying to get to. They're trying to get to symmetric cryptography, and there's different algorithms that you can use for symmetric cryptography. But the question is, how do you get to symmetric cryptography? The interesting thing about symmetric cryptography is that each party uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt. That's why it's a whole lot faster. But you have to have the same key. And so, short of me walking down the hall or, driving my car across the country and saying, hey, here's my symmetric key, and now let's use this thing, then how in the world do you make sure that both ends have the same key, right? The answer to that is the key exchange protocol. And that's where this whole client hello, server hello, key exchange, all that stuff takes place. There's some really cool mathematics that go on there that say, hey, we can exchange certain bits and pieces of information across the open internet that attackers can look at and see and all that stuff. But even though they can see all that stuff, we're going to keep some things secret, on the client side and the server side. And ultimately, we're going to arrive at a symmetric key that we can use for that symmetric encryption. It's super fascinating stuff. Like, how in the world can you let these eavesdropper attacker guys look at everything you're doing, or almost everything you're doing, and yet you arrive at a shared symmetric key, nonetheless. And so it's a fascinating thing. So that is the purpose of this handshake, or one of the purposes, I should say, of the handshake, is to exchange those symmetric keys so that you can have that what we call bulk symmetric encryption that then lasts for the duration of the session of what you're trying to do when you access the web application. So anyway, but that is an overview of the handshake as it looks pre 1.3. So this is like TLS 1.2, 1.1, and kind of previous versions of TLS. And we'll talk about the TLS 1.3 handshake here in a second. All right, to kind of dive into this just a little bit more, I did a little Wireshark capture. This was on Google Chrome, and this was the client hello itself. So you can see there's several things here. There's the, it lists like, hey, this is TLS 1.2 protocol. This is the client hello message itself. It's got a session ID link. It's got all this stuff. But one of the things, and you can see there toward the bottom, is the Cipher Suites that this specific browser, so this is Google Chrome, I don't even remember what version it was, but it comes preloaded with certain Cipher Suites that it supports. And so when it goes to connect to this web server, it's going to say, hey, web server, I want to do this client hello thing. These are all the Cipher Suites that I support. And you'll notice there on the end, if you can see it, I know it's kind of small, but there's a hexadecimal representation that is different for every single Cipher Suite. And that's kind of a cool thing too. If you need to know, hey, which exact Cipher Suite are you talking about, you can identify it by the hexadecimal representation there. I highlighted that one that you can see down there. It's like number 11 out of the 15, hexadecimal 0033. The reason I highlighted that one is when Google Chrome sends this one to the web server, these are in order of what it would prefer to use. So its number one choice would be this, ECDHE, DSA, the blah, 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 that top one up there. It would prefer to use that one, right? It's going to send it to the server, and then the server's going to respond. So when the server responds, you can see here, this is the Wireshark capture on the server side, and notice which one it chose, right? It's that 0033 one, all right? So this is the server, hello, all that stuff. So I wanted to emphasize the fact that the server is the one that gets to choose the encryption and all that stuff that happens, all right? So, and frankly, it makes sense because if you're the server, if you're the one serving up all of this web application data, and someone is coming to you, someone in the form of a browser is coming to you saying, hey, I want to access your website, I want to access your stuff, then the server is going to say, okay, I got it, but we're going to do business on my terms, right? And I am going to configure on the server side what I feel like is appropriate and strong and good and all that stuff. So then if you have a client, if you have a web browser that's coming to you and the only Cipher Suites that they support are stuff that you have chosen to not support and can't handle, then that's going to be not a good thing. And if that happens, then the connection just dies at that point. It never moves forward. So So anyway, I wanted to highlight the fact that the client, when it sends the client hello, it sends a whole bunch of Cipher Suites that it can support, and then the server gets to make the choice on, all right, this is the one that I have now chosen, and it may or may not be your top one. So if you're a web application or web server developer or administrator, I should say, and you have to figure out which Cipher Suites you want to support, you need to think through this and think, hey, do I support the whatever, weak encryption Cipher Suite or not? And sometimes it's a business decision because some of your clients may say, hey, I'm still using Internet Explorer 8 or whatever, and I want to come access your web application, and that's the only way I can come in because of our business decision. And if you don't support ciphers on that really old browser, then we can't access your web application. And then, again, it's just kind of one of those business decisions that you have to make. But ideally, you move forward with the strength of the encryption that you support, and then and then you can say, hey, we're only going to support the stronger stuff. Alrighty. So nonetheless, the server hello comes in. I was going to show you the last little thing here. Excuse me. Is the TLS Handshake itself in Wireshark. You can see the top three things are the TCP connection, the sense, and ACK. And now that the TCP connection is established, now we can start doing this TLS level stuff, right? And then you can see the client hello comes in, and then the server hello with the certificate, and this is the handshake that we just showed a few minutes ago. Alrighty, so it goes through several iterations there before that very bottom one there. You see application data, and that's now the data that's being transferred between the client and the server in that symmetric encryption mode. Alrighty, so that's just a quick flow on Wireshark to show you how that handshake gets set up. All right, Cipher Suite components. I wanted to talk about this for just a second. I know we mentioned this whole Cipher Suite. The client sends the Cipher Suite. The web server has to configure the Cipher Suites, all that kind of stuff. So what does a Cipher Suite look like? What does it do? All that stuff. And there are several components of a Cipher Suite. And the first one there is key exchange. And you're going to see things like DH or RSA. DH is Diffie-Hellman. RSA is Ravesh Shamir Edelman, three dudes that got together that figured out this really cool key exchange stuff. Diffie-Hellman are two guys also. And so those are the different key exchange algorithms that you would see in what would be one of these Cipher Suites, alrighty? And then the next thing that's going to be part of this is the server authentication mechanism. You're going to see things like DSA, the digital signature algorithm, or you'll see RSA, which is Ravesh Shamir Edelman again, and you can use that for server authentication. This is the piece that I talked about a minute ago where it's like, hey, when I connect to your server, do I know that I'm connecting to the right server, right? The next one is the bulk encryption. This is what I talked about a minute ago as well, where we're trying to get to the bulk encryption, the symmetric encryption algorithm. And this is going to be things like AES or triple DES. Triple DES is not secure, but you'll see, but it is a form of symmetric encryption. And then finally, you'll see this message authentication, which it'll be things like SHA, the secure hash algorithm, or MD5 message digest version 5, which MD5 is also not secure, but you'll see it out there as some options. So the interesting thing about this is you see things like triple DES or MD5 for the bulk encryption or the message authentication. And if you allow that on your server, then, what could you be doing in terms of a security risk to your web server, your web application? What you could open the door for is you could have a malicious client that says, hey, let's downgrade, and instead of trying to use, the really high, sophisticated encryption, then why don't we use stuff like triple DES and MD5 for things like bulk encryption and message authentication? And the reason that a client or an attacker would want to do that is because then they can take advantage of the vulnerabilities that are widely known for those specific algorithms. And so if you offer up that stuff, you need to be aware that, hey, you're opening that door, right? That goes back to the business decision I talked about a second ago. But I wanted y'all to be, to understand the components of what a Cipher Suite has in it. And this is critical when you're talking about the TLS protocol itself, obviously. All right, so when you see a Cipher Suite, and we saw a couple of examples a second ago, it's going to look something like this right here. TLS ECDHE, that stands for elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, so that's the key exchange part. And then ECDSA, that one specifically is the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. That's some authentication algorithm. And then it says with AES, that's the advanced encryption standard, that's the bulk encryption. 256, it's 256-bit AES encryption for the bulk encryption, right? And then GCM, that's a mode of AES, the Galois counter mode, right? And then SHA-384, that's the secure hash algorithm, that's that message authentication, 384-bit SHA. All right, so you can potentially imagine that, hey, that's one Cipher suite. Well, what if you had, a different level of SHA encryption, for example? Or what if you didn't use ECDSA? What if you used RSA for message or server authentication or things like that? You can imagine there's a whole bunch of these Cipher suites that you may have available on your web server to hand out, or frankly on your browser to be able to say, hey, this is everything that I support. So I did a little search on the TLS 1.2 alone Cipher suites that are available out there, and there's 41 of them. I know that's an eye chart, and I'm not saying you got to look at every single one of those, but that's a list of just the TLS 1.2. So let's say you have a web server that supports TLS 1.2 Cipher suites, but maybe also TLS 1.1, or what about 1.0? What if you're really going way back machine kind of stuff, Now the list of Cipher suites could grow like crazy huge, and then again, clients are going to be able to potentially downgrade some of those connections, and then use some of the vulnerabilities that that would exist there. All right, so you just need to be careful if you're a web server admin to know what you have configured there. All right, so I wanted to talk about all that stuff with TLS 1.2 and prior with the handshake and the Cipher suite and all that kind of stuff to now lead into TLS 1.3, right? All right, so TLS 1.3, go back. TLS 1.2 has there's 41 of those things listed. TLS 1.1, there's even more. Does anybody know how many Cipher suites the TLS 1.3 protocol has defined by chance? Not everybody at once. Fantastic. I can't handle all the feedback. I'm just kidding. Hey man, I know it's after lunch, trying to throw in a couple of words. Alrighty. So you see that list. Here's TLS 1.3. There's 5 of them. So there's a fundamental I guess I won't call it a debate, just kind of a thought in the world of cryptography that the fewer choices you give someone, the better, right? And if we can make these choices fewer and more secure and all that, then it's just going to help everybody out, right? You're going to not let somebody trip over themselves and cause problems, when maybe they didn't mean to, but they did it inadvertently or whatever. All right, so in TLS 1.3, there's 5 Cipher suites. A couple of cool things about this is you'll notice the hexadecimal representation. I talked about that a second ago. You'll notice it's hex 1.3, right? And then the first one is comma hex 0.1, then 0.2, 3, 4, and 5. And so the hex 1.3 at the beginning there is the TLS 1.3. So you'll notice here too, it's a much shorter Cipher suite. It doesn't even have the key exchange. We'll get to that in a second. That's because the static RSA key exchange has now been completely removed. And so they have said, hey, we are not going to allow that anymore. And I'll get to a story about that here in a second. It's going to blow your mind. Maybe not. We'll see. Alrighty, so there's only 5 Cipher suites in TLS 1.3. Here's the handshake in TLS 1.3. It is a 1 round-trip handshake, which means the client sends a hello, and then it also sends the supported Cipher suites, like it did before. But then this is a really cool thing. It guesses the key agreement protocol, alrighty? Because the key exchange algorithms and the key exchange protocols have been significantly reduced in TLS 1.3, the client is now able to guess, like, hey, server, I think I know what you're thinking today, if I'm going to put some emotions on the client and the server. Hey, server, I think I know what you're feeling today in the sense of key exchange. And so rather than me sending you my supported Cipher suites and then waiting on a response from you, I think I know what you're going to say, right? And most of the time, the client is right when it comes to TLS 1.3 because there's not that many choices when it comes to key exchange. So what that allows them to do is say, hey, I'm going to send you the supported Cipher suites. I'm going to guess which Cipher Suite you're going to choose in advance, and based on that guess, I'm going to go ahead and send you what's called key share material, and that's basically my portion of that key exchange information that gets us closer to the symmetric key that we're trying to get to begin with, right? Excuse me. And so if the client is right, if the client guesses correctly, then what happens? Then the client is like, hey, we're rocking and rolling like really, really quick here, right? So the server is going to say, okay, client, I got your client hello. I know what Cipher Suites you support because you told me, and you've already sent me some key exchange material. Now the server's saying, hey, wait a minute here, client. I still get to make the choice. Y'all remember that? I still get to make the choice as the server. So the server says, I'm still going to choose what Cipher Suite we're doing. But if you guess correctly, good on you, and I've already got your key share, the material, so I can go ahead and start to generate the symmetric key that we're going to use for the bulk encryption. And we can go ahead and get this show on the road, right? Not any more of these round trip back and forth kind of stuff. Alrighty? So then the server sends back its hello, the key agreement protocol that it actually chose, and then its portion of the key share, and then the server finished message, and then right then the key has already been established. So after that one round trip, boom, the handshake is basically over. The client still needs to check the certificate to make sure that the server is who it says it is. But then it has generated the keys based on now the server's key share, and they're talking supremely quicker. So what used to be a total of, you remember that last one? I mean, there was like 8 or 10 or whatever steps. There's all these crazy steps. Well, now there's like 3. And so that's good because of the Ricky Bobby speed, right? That's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to speed here because all of us today, we just cannot give up those extra 50 microseconds or 50 milliseconds of time. You know, we book our day pretty tight, right? And so when I click on that on my phone and I click on ShowMeCon.com, I want it. I need some ShowMeCon, right? Or I need some Amazon. Like I need it immediately. And so we can't wait. And so that's what the IETF has tried to do here, and frankly has done with TLS 1.3, is they have significantly shortened the handshake. And they're like, you're going to get to your encrypted data, which basically means you're going to get your website loaded up supremely faster. It's like twice as fast. Now, there are other factors involved in this crazy thing we call the internet with DNS lookups and other things that could muddy the waters. But in terms of the TLS protocol itself, it's not going to be the bottleneck here anymore in terms of slowing things down. Alrighty, so that is the TLS 1.3 handshake. Okay, the next thing I was going to go over are some notable changes other than just the handshake itself that TLS 1.3 has. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a decent, interesting list. The first one I put there is remove support for weak encryption. There are all kinds of details. If you want to go out there and read the RFC, it's 8446, by the way, and I think I mentioned that here in a second. It's the new TLS 1.3 RFC. But there's a bunch of details on old encryption mechanisms and algorithms and all that have been deprecated as of TLS 1.3. So the support for those have been removed, which is good on one hand, but as soon as you start removing support for stuff, then the legacy applications, all the old stuff, people are going to start screaming and freaking out and saying, hey, how dare you kill my Internet Explorer 8, experience, right? And to which I would say, hey, why don't you, welcome to like 1994 and get off of IE8, right? That kind of stuff. So anyway, but weak encryption, at its basic point has been removed. 0 round trip time resumption was added. We'll get to that here in just a second, but that's really cool because we just talked about the handshake a second ago. How it takes 1 round trip to get to where you're trying to get to go. Now we're doing even better than that. We got a 0 round trip, but that's only for session resumption, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Everything after the server hello is now encrypted. If you go back to the TLS 1.2 and prior, then nothing is really encrypted until basically the end of the TLS handshake. And so a lot of that initial handshake setup and all that stuff is still in the clear, which potentially could give some attackers the availability to get in there and look at stuff and attack stuff. Now, as soon as the server hello goes back, everything's encrypted. So that gets back to the security, the Paul Blart Mall Cop 2 thing that I sent a second ago. If y'all remember nothing from this talk, remember Ricky Bobby and Paul Blart. And I think you'll be like, yes, I'm a cryptographic expert now. I remember that it's all coming back to me, right? Alrighty, perfect forward secrecy is mandatory. I'll talk about that here in a second. But perfect forward secrecy is mandatory. Basically what that means is the RSA algorithm for key exchange is no longer able to be used. Alrighty, I'll go through a little example of that here in a second. All supported bulk encryption ciphers are AEAD, authenticated encryption with associated data. And basically, AEAD ciphers, excuse me, there's essentially a built-in authentication that allows for integrity checks when the encryption itself happens on that bulk encryption. It's just a more secure way of bulk encrypting your data. So those are some of the notable changes. Again, that's not an exhaustive list at all. There's a whole bunch more, but those are some interesting ones. Alrighty, I want to talk about the zero round trip time resumption for a second. I've seen statistics. You know, when you see statistics on the internet, who knows if they're right or not, but we'll go with it. I saw a website say that about 40% of the user experience when you go to a website is a session resumption. So again, this is, hey, I've been at Amazon.com buying my stuff, and then I got off of there, and then, hey, now I remembered I got to go get another thing on Amazon.com, so I got to go back, right? And so that would be a resumption of the previous session that you had. So about 40%-ish of connections are this session resumption. What happens is the server can store a ticket, or the client side actually could as well. There's different ways to implement this, but basically you could establish a session ID or a session ticket that is stored from the previous session, and then you can use that. And so when the client sends its HTTP request, its initial HTTP request back to the server to now resume that session, it's going to say, hey, client hello, which goes back to the handshake we talked about a little bit ago. It's going to send that client hello, but effectively it's going to say, hey, hello, and here is my session ID. And remember me, I'm John. We're the ones that talked a couple of minutes ago when I bought all that stuff, and the server's going to be like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. He needs to buy more stuff. And I'm going to say, all right, here's my hello. Here's that ID that we talked about a second ago. And then I'm going to be able to embed in that some of the cryptographic material that now you can go ahead and use. And we can now both establish that shared key again. And so with the initial client hello, I can go ahead and send my first HTTP GET request, or whatever method it is, right? And so there is no round trip at all. It's like, let's get right to it. Immediately, right? So that's the essence of zero round trip time. So the server then can receive that message, receive that information. It can reconstruct the encryption from the previous session. It doesn't use the exact same encryption keys and all that from the previous session. It uses that material to then create a new encryption key. But since the client has sent that, they both understand, hey, this is what we're going to use as kind of the entry point into now what's going to be the new session key. So anyway, so it's a really cool thing. And again, you talk about speed. This really speeds things up because you don't even have to have a round trip at all to get things started. Alrighty. One thing though in the RFC, this is, and I mentioned a second ago, RFC 8446, that's the TLS 1.3 RFC, which by the way, I meant to mention this a second ago. This thing went through I think it was like 30 drafts, or almost 30 drafts. So, TLS 1.3 actually has been around in draft form for actually several years now. But it just got codified, it just got finalized. But I think it was draft 30 was the actual final version. Don't quote me on that, it may have been in the high 20s, but there was a lot of drafts that went through this thing. Alright, but if you dig through the subsections and the appendices, those places that we all love to go when we're reading our RFCs, then you can go to Appendix E.5 and you'll notice that replayable zero round trip time data presents a number of security threats to TLS using applications. And it's like, now wait a minute, we're supposed to be secure. We're supposed to be Paul Blart up in this thing, right? And it says, unless those applications are specifically engineered to be safe under replay. And then ultimately it says servers have the responsibility to protect themselves against attacks employing zero round trip time data replication. So essentially what could happen is this. You could have a client that sends that zero round trip time, request, and it's got the cryptographic material from the previous session, whatever. If some attacker were able to get a hold of that, then they could send essentially that same zero round trip time, that initial request into the server, and then the server would take action on that because it doesn't, it has the information it needs to then create the keys and all that stuff, but it's going to go ahead and process that first HTTP request. So whenever it does that, if the attacker is like, hey, let me send that also, then the server could theoretically take action on two identical HTTP, gets or posts or deletes or whatever method, is being sent in there, right? So I did some looking around. One company, Cloudflare, what they've done is they've said, hey, this is on the server side, on the web server side, for us to make sure that we process this stuff properly. And so while this could be a potential problem, we need to have safeguards on our web application, which this goes back to saying, hey, whenever you create web applications, you need to create secure web applications, right? Have secure coding practices and all that stuff. What Cloudflare has done is they've said, hey, we only support zero round trip time for GET requests, so HTTP method of GET, with no query parameters. So it's a very, very, niche targeted thing that they allow the zero round trip time request to even do, right? So if you're trying to do an HTTP post or delete or patch or any of those things, then the Cloudflare server, for example, is not going to get that. What other people would say, or basically a good thing to remember here for zero round trip time resumption, if you're going to allow that or not on your web server, is these idempotent actions. Idempotent is where effectively the state of the server does not change. So like if you were to say, give me your home page, and then I was going to request that again, and the state of the server is not going to change on that. It's not like you're deleting stuff or adding, things to a table or a database or whatever. Basically, the idea here, or the overall advice would be disallow zero round trip time resumption for any non-idempotent actions or actions that can change things on the server. So if junk can be changed on the server, with an action, then don't allow the zero round trip time resumption. So while this is a really cool feature of TLS 1.3, proceed with caution, read Appendix E.5 and understand, hey, not everything is just completely without its security issues. All right. So that's zero round trip time. The next thing I was going to talk about is this idea of perfect forward secrecy. We talked about that a second ago. Perfect forward secret ciphers are now completely eliminated in TLS 1.3. So I wanted to go over quickly what perfect forward secrecy is. Many of you may already know this, but just in case you don't, back in the day, if you're using RSA as your key exchange algorithm, then what would happen is your server would have its private key, and then it would hand out its public key via the certificate that it sends back to the client, and it would share the public key with the whole world. But that private key that hangs out on the server, that is a super secure thing that needs to not be shared with anybody, right? So here's what would happen. Is bad guys would go and they would intercept or capture encrypted data between a client and a server, with that communication having been, begun by the RSA key exchange, and ultimately that key exchange is going to land you on that bulk encryption. So maybe they're using AES as their bulk encryption, but RSA is what exchanged the keys to get to the AES encryption, capability. All right, so a bad guy captures all this AES encrypted data, right? And he just hangs on to it, and he hangs on to it for days and months and years and whatever. But he knows it's between these two people that are super interesting people. And he's like, one day, if I could go get that private key off of that web server, then I could frankly, very easily take that private key and create the symmetric key that was then used to encrypt all that data that I got sitting back here on my, hard drive that I've just been storing all this stuff on, right? And so that's exactly what would happen. So the bad guy steals the private key. You may ask yourself, well, how in the world is someone going to steal a private key? Well, this is a security conference, right? So maybe you don't ask yourself that. Maybe you're like, yeah, it totally happens, right? And frankly, there could be even less than malicious reasons. There could be like court subpoenas or stuff like that could make you give up, whatever. So for whatever reason, the bad guy gets a hold of the server's private key, and then it's a fairly trivial exercise to say, okay, now I got your private key. I'm going to generate the symmetric key that was used to encrypt all of that AES traffic, and I've got it all stored over here. I run the decryption, routines on that traffic, and now I have everything that I had captured from weeks and months and years prior. So now I have everything. So that's not a good thing, alrighty? So he uses that key to decrypt everything. All right. The reason that perfect forward secrecy is mandated in TLS 1.3 is perfect forward secret ciphers do not rely on the server's private key for the bulk encryption capability. There is still potentially the RSA that's encryption that's used to identify the server as the correct server that you're connecting to. But for the actual bulk encryption key or the key exchange that gets you down to the bulk encryption, perfect forward ciphers do not rely on the server's private key. This is done most typically via the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. That does not require the server private key at all. Alrighty. So the one question that some may ask is, why would this be a problem? Does anybody in here know why this may be an issue or have a thought? Yep. Okay, yeah, like a DLP, like a data loss prevention security device. Yep, TLS inspection. Yeah, any other thoughts? Good to go. Yeah, there's a bunch of companies out there, you guys may be among them, that say, hey, I've got all these really cool security devices like a DLP or maybe some other really cool security device, some kind of anti-malware something or whatever. And in order for those things to do what they need to do, they can't read encrypted traffic, right? So the traffic has got to be decrypted in order for those things to do what they got to do. Well, how are we going to decrypt that traffic? And typically what companies would do is they would say, hey, for the DLP device or the other, whatever, anti-malware device or whatever it is, I'm just going to share that server's private key on with that trusted device. And then as traffic flows across, it's going to be able to decrypt as well, right? And so everybody's happy, but you're sharing your keys, but you're only sharing your keys with like trusted peeps, right? Well, now you can't share keys because this type of encryption doesn't rely on the server private key. So some people are freaking out over this. Here's an email that this guy sent to the Internet Engineering Task Force working group for TLS 1.3, and I'll read this to you really quick. I know it's the top part, I guess, is some small letters. All right, he said, hey, my name is Andrew Kennedy, and I work at BITS, the Technology Policy Division of the Financial Services Roundtable. This is fsroundtable.org/BITS. My organization represents approximately 100 of the top 150 U.S.-based financial services companies, including banks, insurance, consumer finance, and asset management firms. And he goes on to say, deprecation of this RSA key exchange in TLS 1.3 will cause significant problems for financial institutions, almost all of whom are running TLS internally and have significant security critical investments in out-of-band TLS decryption. Basically what that means is we got a bunch of these security devices. We're a bank, we're a financial institution, and we rely on sharing that server private key to these devices so that they can do their job, right? And if we don't have a server private key to be able to share, then they're in the dark. And now we don't, they basically just fall out of this whole flow of traffic, right? And so that's not a good thing. All right. So the IETF working group, when they got this email, I don't think it was dated right here, but when they got this email, they were like, 80% of the way down the road, and they had been doing all this kind of work. So how do you guys think that the IETF working group responded to this request? Yeah. Fortunately, I was able to steal their private key, and I was able to hack into some actual footage of the response of the working group. And so they were like, no. All right, so here's the response. This is the actual response back to them. Hi, Andrew. This is Kenny talking. Kenny's a nice guy because he says cheers at the end, by the way. Hi, Andrew. My view concerning your request, no. So you got to love Kenny, man. He keeps it short and to the point. The rationale, we're trying to build a more secure internet. Thank you very much. That's my little add-on there, all right? Meta-level comment, for those that can't read it in the back. You're a bit late to the party, right? We're metaphorically speaking at the stage of emptying the ashtrays and hunting for the not quite empty beer cans. So come on, dude. The party's over, basically. All right? More exactly, we are at draft 15, which ironically was only like halfway down the road, because it was like almost 30 when they did this. But nonetheless, draft 15 is like way down the road at this point. And RSA key transport disappeared from the spec about a dozen drafts ago. I know the banking industry is usually a bit slow off the mark, but this takes the biscuit. And then he says cheers, because cheers always kind of, softens the blow there at the end. Cheers, Kenny. All the best, BFF forever, yours truly, Kenny, whatever. All right, so it's interesting that while perfect forward secret ciphers are now mandated, not everyone is excited about that. And frankly, people are scrambling today to be like, how in the world are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to crack this nut on allowing our security devices to watch our encrypted traffic? I mean, because we can't just throw away all of our DLP, security devices or our firewalls or our whatever, right? I mean, these things have got to do their job. I will say this. Some companies are making, I guess what I'll call kind of a central orchestration device whereby traffic can come into those, and then that thing decrypts the traffic, and then that one orchestration, kind of a centralized orchestration device, then is connected to all of the security devices, and when it does the decryption, it can send the unencrypted traffic to the security devices, and then once all the security devices have done their thing, it comes back up to that central point, and then it kicks it on out to the internet, or vice versa, from the internet into the internal network. So anyway, so there are solutions that are out there, but it's a big problem for a lot of companies today. So perfect forward secrecy. So when you hear perfect forward secrecy, which by the way, the reason that it's called perfect forward secrecy is because it does not rely on the server's private key, then they talk about that being forward secret, because then if the private key is ever compromised in the future or forward from today, then it doesn't matter because it's still going to be a secret because it didn't rely on the server's private key, right? The way that you achieve perfect forward secrecy is you use what's called an ephemeral key. And ephemeral, just the term ephemeral in general means that it's very short-lived. It doesn't last very long, And so if you generate a new key with every single session that you have between a client and a server, then that in effect is called an ephemeral key. And so now if you were to somehow compromise that one key that was then used to generate, that encrypted traffic, you would only be able to decrypt that one single session between client and server. So, gone are the days where you're able to get your hard drive and just capture data for weeks and months and years and be like, hey, now I got the gold mine and I'm able to get into this stuff later. You cannot do that anymore with perfect forward secret ciphers. Okay, so it's good, but some people are not too happy about it, like Andrew. All right, and I think we all need to hire Kenny to be our, PR or whatever response. He can be our help desk response email builder. That'd be awesome. Just say cheers at the end of every email and everyone will feel a little bit better about themselves. Alrighty. So a couple of quick things I wanted to mention too. How do I configure TLS 1.3 in my browser? So some of you may be asking yourself, hey, this is kind of cool stuff. I want to know how I can take advantage of that 0 round trip time resumption that we talked about a second ago, or I want to know how I can do that really short handshake and kind of get to my page quick. So how do I do this? So I went through Firefox and then Google Chrome, and these are just some checks you can do to to see if TLS 1.3 is in fact enabled on your browser. So for Firefox, you type about:config up there in your little URL address bar, and it'll bring you to your configuration page. And then you can search for TLS, and then it'll bring up all the TLS related stuff. And there's this one, I don't know if you can see it very well back there, but it's called security.tls.version.max. And so what this basically says is, what is the maximum version of TLS that we're going to allow on this browser? And the answer here is the value is 4, and that basically means TLS 1.3. So there's hexadecimal 0301, 0302, 0303, 0304. So 0304 is TLS 1.3 in this specific case. All right, so what I did is I configured my Firefox browser to the value 4, and then I went to a website that I know is configured to accept TLS 1.3 connections, right? They have configured their web server so that their Cipher Suites prefer TLS 1.3 ciphers, and I went there and I was like, hey, are we going to be able to do this thing? So the question is, we've got a browser that now is able to handle TLS 1.3 connections, and I'm about to visit a web server that prefers 1.3 ciphers. So are we going to be able to make a match here? And the answer, of course, is yes. So Firefox version 61 and on supports TLS 1.3. You can get in there and check based on what I just said on whether it's actually configured or not. This website, I know there's others. This one is a website called istlsfastyet.com. It's a pretty cool website that goes over a lot of TLS information. But anyway, you can visit that, and you can see down here, I know it's hard to see, but it says TLS 1.3 there at the end. That right there, by the way, is the Cipher Suite, right, that was chosen between the browser and the web server. It was TLS, it was AES 128-bit encryption, Galois counter mode, which by the way, if y'all remember, I talked a second ago about AEAD ciphers. Those are for the bulk encryption ciphers. Galois counter mode is probably the most popular of the AEAD-enabled bulk encryption ciphers. So don't be surprised if you see a lot of GCM, mode on your AES encryption when you look at your Cipher Suites. I know many of you spend hours looking at your Cipher Suites that were negotiated between your client and your server, right? Every time you visit a web page. I kid, of course. But if you happen to do that, you'll notice probably a lot of GCM. And then SHA-256 was used as the MAC, as the message authentication. All right, so then I went to Google Chrome and I said, hey, can I get to that same website, istlsfastyet.com, because I know that it's set up for TLS 1.3. And Google Chrome 63 Plus supports TLS 1.3, and Google's on as you might know, it's like 79, or it's in the high 70s right now, I think. So it's 75. Okay. So it's several versions ago, Google Chrome supports TLS 1.3. And sure enough, there it is right there, TLS 1.3 was the version used here. It's kind of cool there. You can see here, Google and Firefox use completely different naming standards, if you will, or nomenclature to show you what Cipher Suite was used on this connection. So this one, it only says X25519, which, by the way, that's some of the elliptic curve cryptography. That's the actual name of the curve that was used for the key exchange stuff. So it's the name of the curve itself is 25519. And then AES 128, and there's that GCM again that I talked about, because it's an AEAD cipher that is now mandated in TLS 1.3. So notice Google Chrome doesn't even mention the message authentication. It doesn't even say what kind of SHA stuff it used at all. So it's kind of an interesting thing between browsers. If you use Firefox or Chrome, or check out Safari or whatever your, Microsoft Edge or whatever it is, you can see the differences between how they represent the actual Cipher Suite that was used. The Cipher Suite is the same Cipher Suite, it's just the way that your browser actually shows you, hey, this is what was used. It's kind of interesting the differences between like Firefox and Chrome and all that stuff. So anyway, so TLS 1.3 is, I guess just to kind of recap here, I got like 3 minutes. To kind of recap here, or no, I don't have 3 minutes. It's actually 3:29. I looked at that 3:29. I thought I had 3 minutes and 29 seconds. No, it's actually 3:29. So I'm supposed to be done, I think, at 3:30. So I got just a second. Like many other things in technology, you may look at this and you may say, hey, this is kind of cool stuff. I don't know if I can just hop on board right away, that kind of thing. But the world is moving in this direction and you got to move with it, So you can kick and scream and all that. And I'm not accusing anybody of that. But as the world of technology moves a certain way, you have got to adapt. And so you need to learn about this stuff. You got to say, hey, now I know what, zero round trip time resumption is. Now I know what AEAD ciphers are. Now I know what perfect forward secrecy means. And I know that I can't share a private key with my, security devices anymore. Like, that's a pretty interesting and significant problem, right? Well, I won't say problem. It's a challenge that we can create a solution for, right? So it's an interesting opportunity to excel for all of us, right? But those are the things that your business or your customers or whatever are going to run into that you need to be aware of. So while TLS 1.3 does provide much more speed and much more security, it takes away a lot of the junk that was out there that allowed you to be downgraded and be attacked, from a number of vulnerabilities. All that stuff is gone whenever you just implement TLS 1.3, which, by the way, on a web server, you can offer TLS 1.3, Cipher Suites and all that, but you can also offer TLS 1.2 and 1.1 and all the way back. But one day, people are going to be like, hey, it's 1.3 and forward, right? Like 1.2 is a thing of the past, kind of like SSL-v2 or whatever, right? So we're headed this direction. All right, so with that, I tried to look up quotes for how the world is changing and how we need to move with it, right? And I found this really interesting quote, and I didn't realize it was like this. But if anybody's ever seen The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, the movie actually starts out with this quote, and it says, "The world has changed. I see it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air." And then slightly modified. I didn't realize this was in the original version. I noticed it in my stronger encryption keys and faster mobile experience. Who knew J.R.R. Tolkien? He was way ahead of his time. So anyway, like I said, man, the world is moving. Let's move with it. Let's understand the protocols of the day, and let's stay ahead of this stuff. So it's great to be here at ShowMeCon, and I appreciate your attention and your time today. So you guys have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, John. Everybody give it up for John Wagnon. John, you actually have 4 minutes left.
Oh.
Over here.
Oh, good to go. I'm sorry.
Any questions?
One, man. Yeah.
Any questions for John? Question up here front.
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir.
So I think it's fairly common to man-in-the-middle TLS. To
Yep.
monitor traffic and all kinds of stuff.
Yep.
And for legitimate reasons, done by legitimate organizations. When you go to 1.3 and we have the perfect forward latency, does that mean I can no longer man on middle TLS?
It's always hard to say you can absolutely no longer ever do something, but that becomes significantly more difficult, yes. There's a lot of, I guess to speak a little more broadly, a lot of the attacks like Beast and Freak and Logjam and a lot of those things that were present in earlier versions of TLS are frankly gone now with the new, because a lot of those weak encryption standards have now been removed. Effectively those are not able to happen anymore. So while I won't say, hey, it's completely not possible at all, it becomes much more difficult. So
I don't man in the middle SSL like or TLS.
Yeah.
I'm taking advantage of weaknesses in the encryption. I do it
Right.
by making clients trust me as a
now, yes, now that gets into, of course we've talked about this for a long time, but that gets into some of the other parts of this with like certification authorities, and do you trust the server, and has the certificate been issued properly, and is it trusted, and all that kind of stuff. So you could take advantage of some of those kinds of things to kind of get by and do some of the things you're talking about. And so while it's a similar conversation, but not precisely like in the RFC for TLS 1.3. Does that make sense? So yeah, so there still would potentially be some opportunities for things like that. But those rely on some other things that we need to make sure we have, secure as well. Like when you get a certificate or when you trust a certain certificate, then that needs to be done properly by the proper certification authority and et cetera, et cetera, So yeah, good to go. Yeah, great question.
All right.
All right. Yes, sir.
The that you were going to test the encryption.
Uh-huh.
The same for Chrome and Firefox?
Yeah, I went to that same website that I talked about saying, is TLS fast yet? It's all one big word.com. Yeah, so you can go there. And that's not the only TLS 1.3 website out there, obviously, but that's one I know is TLS 1.3 configured. So yeah, good stuff.
Thanks, John.
Oh, I think
one more?
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Oh, you need the slides. Now that's going to cost you a pretty penny. No, I'm just kidding. I need your server's private key, and I'll give you the slides. I'm just kidding. No, we can. Dave, I don't know how we. I'm happy to maybe meet with me in a little bit, and I'll email them to you. I mean, I'll share them with whoever. But
yeah, that's
is that probably as good as
a
any?
Speaker, we don't require him to give us the slides. Again, Adrian Crenshaw, Iron Geeks, recording all these. They're up on his site.
Okay.
They'll be up later on, and the slides are there as well.
Yeah. Hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever too. But yeah, I'll give them to you.
All right, John. Give it a big hand for John
man. Thanks,
again.
everybody. Appreciate it.